So hi everyone, and welcome to this webinar in the SSH Network webinar series. So that's the Social Sciences and Humanities Network related to IPBES. My name is Håkon Stokland, and I organized the network with Maria Stenseke, Marla Emery, and also an additional team of scholars. And today we have this webinar that we've been looking forward to. Dr. Alice Vadrot from the University of Vienna will have a presentation titled "Why are the Social Sciences and Humanities Needed in the Works of IPBES? A Systematic Review of the Literature." Before we get started, just a few points of information. So for those of you who don't know the SSH network, there's more information about it on this web page that you can see here, and it's also possible to join the network on the web page. So Alice Vadrot is Associate Professor for International Relations with a focus on environmental politics at the Department of Political Science of the University of Vienna. Her work addresses the role of knowledge and science in global environmental politics. She has conducted extensive research on the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which we all know as IPBES, and developed the concept of epistemic selectivities. Her ERC project develops and applies a new methodological approach for grounding the analysis of science policy interrelations in the field of marine biodiversity politics in empirical research. So really exciting stuff. So, and with this, Alice, I give you the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much for this kind introduction and also for the invitation. My talk today will look into the role that the social sciences and humanities can play in the works of IPBES, and it will be based on a systematic literature review that I conducted together with a team from the institution a few years ago. I will first talk about the background of the study that we conducted, then about the literature review itself. And as you will see, it's a little bit outdated, and many really distinguished, excellent colleagues have conducted research in between on IPBES that unfortunately it will not be covered in this talk. But I still think that the classification that we have developed is quite useful for ongoing discussions. And then I will give you a brief outlook and discuss future needs and challenges based on my current research. So the picture that you can see here on the left side is from a workshop that was organized by the by the German Ministry of Science and Research, and that was in 2015, a long time ago. And this workshop was conducted to address one specific problem and observation by the German Coordination Office of IPBES, and that was that there is a lack of social sciences and humanities among the authors that applied to become involved in IPBES assessments. So there was the perception we cannot reach out sufficiently to social scientists and scholars from the humanities, and so there is a lack of authorship from the group that is, however, thoroughly needed. So what we did as a group of experts is to publish a policy brief that we circulated at the fourth plenary of IPBES that took place in Kuala Lumpur in 2016 to raise awareness on the need to really address different scholars from the social sciences and humanities, but also to target institutions that could be relevant to spread the word to different communities. So we also published a short commentary in Nature, and as you can see here on the right side, we published a special issue in the journal Innovation, the European Journal of Social Science Research, with different papers addressing this specific topic and shedding light on the need to include the social sciences and humanities in IPBES. So there was a really, from 2015 to the publication of this special issue in 2018, several events that were mostly promoted and pushed by the German Coordination Office, and I had the honor to take part in some of these activities. So the literature review itself had the aim to identify the range of possible social science and humanities contribution to IPBES that are expressed in the literature. So instead of focusing on what we thought would be needed, we looked at all papers published between a specific time frame on IPBES to identify what the scholars themselves consider as important when we talk about the need to include the social sciences and humanities. So we assessed the literature dealing with IPBES, and we tried to build a typology describing the main ways in which contributions from the social sciences and humanities to IPBES have been conceived so far. We also discussed these contributions in light of broader debates on the role of the social sciences and humanities in nature conservation. And we discussed how these debates relate to IPBES conceptual framework, and also tried to analyze some blind spots in the perception of how SSH could substantially contribute to the works of IPBES. And we used a very specific example, the example of economics, and how scholars from the field of economy were included into the assessment on pollinators, pollination, and food production, the first thematic assessment of IPBES that was adopted at the fourth plenary of IPBES in 2016. Just to give you an idea about the methods that we used and the samples, we used a 3-step methods. We did a search in Scopus, including IPBES and IMOZEP. So IMOZEP, I don't know how familiar you are with it, but that was a French initiative that preceded the establishment of IPBES, and that was used in some of the papers. So we wanted to include also research published using this specific term. And we had 123 papers that were published from 2008 to 2017. What you can see here on the graph is that can you still see my presentation? Yeah, what you can see here on the graph is that especially after 2015, there was really a significant increase of papers using the keyword IPBES in its abstract keyword and titles, so an increased interest in IPBES. We tried to focus on papers that were not just mentioning IPBES implicitly, but really focused on papers that were explicitly addressing IPBES in its text. So for instance, you find papers from the natural sciences that say in the abstract, our work is relevant in light of the future assessment of IPBES. So we did not use these kind of papers because they didn't talk about IPBES as an object of research as such. We ended up with a final sample of 45 papers. We conducted a qualitative analysis with Atlas TI, coding all mentions of social sciences and humanities to identify and distinguish the expected types of contributions from the social sciences and humanities. And on this basis, we built a typology representing the different expectations and areas of intervention where the social sciences and humanities can make a difference. And the reason why we adopted this quite systematic approach with a focus on the literature was that when we tried to talk about these issues during the workshop, but also with colleagues, we quickly noticed that there are so many different ways that the social sciences and humanities can contribute that a specific systematization would actually enable us to talk more systematically about how to actually include the social sciences and the knowledge associated with it. What I did before this talk is I did another Scopus search just to see how the literature developed in the meantime. And so you can see there are 3 times more papers, but what you also see, and I was surprised to see this this morning, that there is a decrease actually. So after 2019, approximately, we see that the number of papers published using the keyword IPBES are actually decreasing. So that's quite interesting. Obviously, we don't know, maybe the trend goes up again when 2022 has ended, but I think this is interesting. I don't know why this is the case. So regarding the results, so what we found in the sample of papers that were part of the analytical or of the sample that we used is that there were different dimensions And we organized all papers regarding these two dimensions. So the first dimension was the thematic area on which SSH can intervene. And the second dimension was the very concrete contribution that the social sciences and humanities can make in a very specific given area. So we distinguished three areas where the social sciences and humanities are expected to play a role. And the first area are the drivers and causes of biodiversity loss. The second thematic area are the politics and policies for biodiversity conservation and use. And the third area is IPBES and the politics of knowledge. So what we found is that many papers addressing IPBES actually were talking about IPBES as an object of research from a social science perspective, making, for instance, recommendations on how IPBES itself can be designed, on how the science policy interface can actually be organized. And in each of these areas, we have identified three types of very concrete contributions that the social sciences and humanities were expected to make. The first one is contextualizing and framing. So the social sciences as humanities as a possibility to reframe what biodiversity loss is, what it means, how it can be communicated to policymakers and other stakeholders. Then the second type of contribution is knowledge production. So the simple fact that social scientists and scholars from the humanities produce research that might be relevant for IPBES assessments. And the third concrete contribution is process design. So the knowledge that social sciences and humanities has developed on how to organize specific things, including science policy interfaces. So this is the typology that you also find in our paper. So you can see you have the thematic area with drivers and causes of biodiversity loss, the politics and policies for biodiversity conservation and use, and IPBES and the politics of knowledge. And then on the other scale, you have the types of contributions from the social sciences and humanities, including the contextualization and framing, the knowledge production and process design. I will not go through all of them, but give you some example. So for instance, when we look at the role of the social sciences and humanities in contextualization and framing, then regarding the drivers and causes of biodiversity loss means that the social sciences and humanities are expected to contribute to an understanding of the socio-ecological systems and how they relate to human well-being, human rights, equity, and justice. So in other words, the literature that we analyzed, they often associated the social sciences and humanities as important contributions to recontextualize biodiversity loss, especially regarding an understanding of socio-ecological systems. Then contextualizing and framing in the second dimension, the politics and policies for biodiversity conservation and use. Here, many papers focused on the role of well-use institutions, conflicts and power relations in policymaking and implementation, and associated the social sciences and humanities with these kind of issues, hoping that the social sciences and humanities can broaden our understanding of what the politics and policies for biodiversity conservation and use should look like, and really on the need to address power relations, well-use institutions, and the conflict that make it so difficult to actually implement conservation policies. Contextualizing and framing regarding IPBES and the politics of knowledge. Here, many papers associated the social sciences and humanities perspective with a critical understanding of what the nature of knowledge on biodiversity is, on the need to go beyond positivistic approaches, to consider alternative knowledge forms, but also to reflect on how science policy interfaces work and how they should work, how they should actually also broaden our understanding and include society as a third pillar in the science policy interface. If we look at knowledge production here, we found that the social sciences and humanities are expected to examine the drivers and causes of environmental and societal change, and explaining how human behavior, well-use narratives, and world use can be changed. So this element of transformative change that is very present now in IPBES and its assessment, looking at transformative change, is already an issue in the literature, when we conducted our analysis in 2018. Regarding the politics and policies for biodiversity conservation and use, social science and humanities are expected to produce knowledge on the effectiveness of institutions and policy and economic instruments that you could use to actually implement biodiversity policies. Just to give you an idea on process design and how this relates to the three different thematic areas. So here, literature expects social sciences and humanities to contribute to the development of indicators and approaches for mapping, comparing, and predicting practices of biodiversity conservation and use. So I think if we look at what is happening right now in the conventional biological diversity and the development of the global biodiversity framework that has a very strong focus on the development of indicators and clear targets. So this is definitely an area where the social sciences and humanities can contribute, especially if we look at the influence of economies and political systems, so the so-called indirect drivers on nature protection and land use, for instance. Process design regarding the second thematic area includes the development of techniques for deliberation, participation, and pluralistic approaches for modeling, predicting, and assessing risk, trade-offs, and conflicts. And process design regarding the third thematic area, IPBES and politics of knowledge, includes the development of concepts and instruments for designing and operating science policy or science policy society interfaces according to the principles of inter and transdisciplinary participation and co-production. And I presented this now, but I think when we developed this, the debate was not as advanced as it is now. So I think IPBES has done a lot to actually implement many of the things that we mention here. And I'm really positively surprised on how dynamic the debate, but also the implementation of some of these issues has been in the meantime and in the context of IPBES and its the production of its assessments. So if we go to the next slide, I'm sorry. What we found still are some blind spots, and I think that in the meantime there is a lot of awareness that these blind spots existed in earlier debates. So, for instance, that there is not one perspective coming from the social sciences and humanities. There are diverse framings within different social science and humanities disciplines, within different theoretical schools and research areas. There is awareness that this is an issue, but still, when we were doing our study, we had the impression that the social sciences and humanities were seen as like one kind of coherent set of perspectives, which is obviously not true. Regarding knowledge production, we found that there was sometimes a narrow understanding of particular social science phenomena resulting from the need to compromise. So, for instance, when you talk about the economy, obviously there isn't the economy, and depending on your perspective, if you have like an institutionalist perspective or more critical stance on some economic developments, you might come to very different solutions on how you should transform our economies, for instance. Then we also found that there was a danger to view this knowledge from social sciences and humanities as just complementing research that was framed and developed by natural scientists, or simply as an additional asset to natural science findings for better implementation and communication at the later stage. So, as some of you may know, when you submit a project to Horizon 2020, now scientists, they just have to include the social sciences and humanities. But there is the danger that this is done at the end of a project, or it's done just to get the funding, but not in a manner to really produce research from the beginning in an inter and transdisciplinary manner that is meaningful. Yeah, but I think you find some changes here, and I'm involved now in a big Horizon 2020 project, and I must say that there is awareness among the natural sciences as well that co-production needs an integration of the social sciences and humanities and the natural sciences straight from the beginning of a project. Regarding process design, so sometimes when we analyzed some of the expectations of what the social scientists can do, we had the impression that there was this vision of institutional fixes. So there is a need to discuss the appropriateness of instruments and approaches related to the economic, political, and cultural context within which they are designed and applied. It's not easy to transfer one solution that works in one context to another context. And especially now when we talk about transformative change, what might work, I don't know, in Scandinavia might not be a good solution for Austria or for Senegal or for Australia. So there is the need also to contextualize social science approaches and knowledge within the specific political system and the political culture of a nation state, of a specific region, an organization, or a community. The case that we use to illustrate the need to consider some of these blind spots is the example of economics and the pollination assessment. So you have one discipline, economics, but there are many possibilities to actually use an economic lens to assess the value of pollinators, pollination, and food production. And this is something that you can look up in our paper. I will not go into detail in this talk. And coming to the question of how we translated these findings to the needs for IPBES, this means several things. And I think this is pretty outdated because the social science network that was established, and I think Hakan, you and your colleagues did an amazing job in bringing the communities together. But what we came up in our paper as a recommendation is that there should be some kind of social sciences and humanities task force, including diverse experts from the fields of the social sciences and humanities that should be represented in and involved at different stages of IPBES and its assessment. So it's not enough to select more authors that can contribute to some of the assessment. It's important to include the social sciences and humanities at different stages of IPBES, the scoping, having social science and humanities scholars represented in plenaries, for instance. And the idea that we developed at that time was to have a task force. I think this is what actually the SSH network is doing now, to represent different disciplines, including diverse methodological and theoretical orientations, to regularly bring together scholars from these disciplines, but also, and I don't know if this is happening, but I assume it's something that you are as well doing because of your networks and connections to IPBES. But such a network should also act as a facilitator and support the multidisciplinary expert panel of IPBES in the selection, for instance, of authors and reviewers, to communicate the calls broadly to different communities, act as a contact point between IPBES and relevant associations and academic societies, representing scholarship already. And we also imagined different roles that this task force or network could have. That's to identify and discuss procedures, approaches, participatory processes for integrating the social sciences and humanities, so to be creative on how we can matter to IPBES and what we can do, but also to prioritize knowledge and data needs for policymakers addressed through, for instance, catalyzing efforts to generate new knowledge. So what do we need? I assume now, for instance, in the transformative assessment of IPBES, yes, they might be able to draw on existing research, but there are future research needs that should also or could also be discussed by the SSH network, and networking within the different disciplines and communities of the social sciences and humanities. So from my experience, there are many interesting scholars doing very relevant work, but they might never perceive or conceive themselves to be relevant in the IPBES. Yeah, so I think this is also something that is very important, to reach out to communities doing already relevant work, but that might not consider themselves relevant. So two outlooks, two things that came to my mind that are not in the paper, especially because of my ongoing work. I think there are future challenges and needs. The first is the North-South divide, so to reach out to scholars that work outside Europe, social scientists that do relevant work, but also I think the the need as social scientists to be aware that biodiversity research is unequally distributed. This is true for natural science research, of course. This is a map that is part of a publication that was published last year in Marine Policy, and we looked at the global distribution of marine biodiversity research. This is marine, obviously, it's a special case, but still there are big gaps in this global distribution of publications on marine biodiversity, and this reflects also the global imbalances regarding data availability, regarding possibilities to actually produce your knowledge. And I would assume that the map would be even worse if you would look only for social science research. Yeah. So this is one aspect, but this aspect is really important if we discuss the need for transformative change at a global level. This is something I argue in a publication from 2020 that was published in Environmental Science and Policy. So the objective to look at transformative change and to use this lens in IPBES assessment really puts a lot of work on the shoulders of social scientists and scholars from the humanities, because we are the ones that actually study society, the possibilities for change, and should contribute our knowledge to this process. But it is not easy, as I said, because of some of the historical, institutional, and political, cultural specificities in each of the countries where we work. Then social science and humanities have different roles, including to think about the structural conditions of the production and use of knowledge to support policymaking. I think this is also what I wanted to say with this picture. The second, I would say, need or challenge is something that I observed in my current research in the framework of the ERC research project, Maripol Data. So there seems to be like a terrestrial-marine divide. This is a word that it doesn't exist, but also when you look at current discussions in a CBD, Global Biodiversity Framework, there seems to be tension between ocean and land-related issues. And it will be a challenge, I think, to bring these two communities together. There is a lot of interaction already. Scholars such as Professor Isabella Sousa Pinto, she's a very active natural scientist in IPBES representing Portugal. She is a marine scientist, and there are a few other examples, but I think that as social scientists, we can also try to reach out to marine social scientists. They are forming at the moment. They are also trying to network more. So maybe reaching out to these communities could be an interesting contribution of the SSH network also to IPBES, if we demonstrate that we also try to reach out to these communities. What you see on the right side, this is a publication I did with colleagues from my research project, where we try to identify what social sciences can do to contribute the UN Decade of Ocean Science. Yeah, so for instance, do research on research practices, data-related practices, develop scientific concepts and science advice. So you can have a look if you're interested, but basically we argue that in order to understand inequalities, inclusiveness, transparency, values, interests, conflicts, trade-offs, transformation, best practices. So these are all issues that relate to the production and use of ocean science, where social science knowledge is lacking. Yeah, and there are many aspects I think that could also be relevant for IPBES. So yeah, having said that, I would like to thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions and maybe also to a discussion on what I'm missing and how our literature review can be enhanced with some ongoing work as well.
Thank you so much for this, Alice. That's really interesting, and thanks also for these updated reflections based on your paper. That's really interesting, and thanks for your kind words about the SSH network. We certainly work to engage in many of the topics you brought up there. So thanks.